It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September, and the leaves outside Jefferson Elementary School had just started turning orange and gold. The school day had ended about 30 minutes ago, but the building was still full of noise and energy because of the after-school programs that ran until 5 o'clock. Parents and grandparents were starting to arrive in the parking lot, and some were already waiting in the main hallway near the front office. Among them was a woman who looked to be in her early 60s. She had come straight from her small apartment across town, taking 2 buses to get here because she didn't drive anymore. Her name was Elena, and she was here to pick up her granddaughter, who was 7 years old and attended the school's music program every Tuesday and Thursday. Elena was not the kind of person who stood out in a crowd. She wore a simple gray cardigan that she had owned for at least 10 years, and a pair of dark pants that were comfortable for walking. Her shoes were flat and practical, and her silver-streaked hair was pulled back into a loose bun at the back of her head. She carried a small brown purse that had seen better days, and she walked with the quiet, careful steps of someone who preferred to go unnoticed. When she entered the school, she smiled politely at the security guard near the door and signed her name in the visitor log. The guard barely glanced at her because she looked like any other grandmother who came to pick up a child. Nothing about her appearance suggested anything unusual or remarkable. Elena made her way down the long hallway toward the music room where her granddaughter attended her piano lessons. The walls were covered with student artwork and colorful posters about reading and kindness, and the floors were that shiny linoleum that squeaked under certain shoes. She could hear the sounds of children practicing instruments somewhere nearby. Piano scales mixed with the occasional squeak of a violin and the hollow tapping of a drum. It was chaotic, but also somehow pleasant, like the sound of young people discovering something new. Elena found a wooden bench near the music room door and sat down to wait. She was early by about 15 minutes, so she folded her hands in her lap and watched the activity around her with patient eyes. A few teachers walked past carrying stacks of papers and coffee cups. Some students ran by laughing before an adult voice reminded them to walk, not run. It was ordinary school life, and Elena enjoyed watching it unfold. She thought about her granddaughter, whose name was Sophia, and who had only been taking piano lessons for about 4 months. Sophia was still learning the basics and could only play simple songs with one hand at a time. But she loved it, and that was what mattered most to Elena. Every week Sophia would come home and play whatever new piece she had learned, and Elena would sit beside her on the piano bench and listen as if it were the most beautiful music in the world. Because to her it was. After a few minutes, Elena noticed something happening across the hall. There was a larger room with double doors that were propped open, and inside she could see a grand piano sitting on a small stage. The room appeared to be the school auditorium where assemblies and performances were held. What caught her attention was a group of about 5 or 6 teachers gathered around the piano. They were laughing and talking loudly, and it was clear they were having some kind of informal gathering. After the school day had ended, one of them sat at the piano and played a few notes that didn't quite sound right. The others burst into laughter, and someone made a joke about how terrible it sounded. Another teacher took a turn and managed to play a short melody that Elena recognized as the beginning of a popular pop song. More laughter followed, and someone clapped sarcastically. Elena watched from her bench with a small smile on her face. It reminded her of something from long ago, a memory she hadn't thought about in years. She could tell that none of these teachers were trained pianists, but they were enjoying themselves, and that was nice to see. Adults often forgot how to have fun like that. One of the teachers was a young man who looked to be in his late 20s. He had curly brown hair and wore a tie with cartoon characters on it, which suggested he probably taught one of the younger grades. He was the loudest of the group and seemed to be the one organizing the impromptu piano session. At one point, he looked up and noticed Elena watching from across the hall. He waved at her with a big friendly smile. Elena gave a small wave back, not wanting to seem rude. The young teacher said something to the others and then walked toward Elena felt a little nervous because she preferred to stay invisible in situations like this, but it was too late to pretend she hadn't been watching. "Hey, there," the young teacher said as he approached. His voice was cheerful and welcoming. "Are you waiting for one of our music students?" Elena nodded. "Yes, my granddaughter. She should be done in about 10 minutes, I think." The teacher glanced at the clock on the wall. "Oh, yeah, the lessons run until 4:30. He smiled again. "And Mr. Bradley, by the way, I teach second." "Great." Elena shook his hand gently. "Nice to meet you." Mr. Bradley gestured toward the auditorium. "We were just messing around in there. Some of us are trying to learn piano, but as you probably heard, we are not very good." Elena chuckled softly. "It sounded like you were having fun, though. That's what matters." Mr. Bradley laughed. "Yeah, I guess." So he paused for a moment, and then his eyes lit up with an idea. "Hey, do you play piano at all?" Elena hesitated. She wasn't sure how to answer that question. It had been so long since anyone had asked her. "Well," she said slowly, "I used to a long time ago." Mr. Bradley clapped his hands together. "Oh, perfect. You should come join us. We're just playing around, nothing serious. I promise we won't judge." Elena shook her head politely. "Oh, no, thank you. I'm just waiting for Sophia." But Mr. Bradley was persistent in that friendly way that teachers often are with shy students. "Come on," he said. "It will be fun. We have this impossible piece of music that none of us can figure out. Maybe you can help." Before Elena could protest further, a woman with short black hair appeared beside Mr. Bradley. This was Miss Chun, who taught 4th grade. She had overheard the conversation. "Did I hear you used to play?" she asked Elena with genuine interest. Elena nodded slowly, feeling more uncomfortable by the second. "Just a little bit, a very long time ago." Miss Chun smiled warmly. "Well, a little bit is more than most of us. Please come take a look. We found this old sheet music in a storage cabinet, and it's been driving us crazy for weeks." Another teacher joined them now. This was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head. Name was Mrs. Rodriguez, and she was the school's choir director. She had a kind face and a gentle voice. "We don't mean to pressure you," she said to Elena, "but sometimes it's nice to have fresh eyes on something, or fresh ears, I suppose." Elena looked at the 3 teachers standing before her. They seemed genuinely friendly, and there was no way for her to refuse without seeming impolite. She glanced toward the music room door. Sophia would still be in her lesson for at least another 10 minutes. "I suppose I could take a quick look," Elena said quietly. Teachers seemed delighted and led her across the hall into the auditorium. 2 more teachers were still standing near the piano. One was a tall man with gray hair who taught science, and the other was a younger woman with red hair who worked in the school's library. They looked up curiously as the group approached. "We found someone who actually plays piano," Mr. Bradley announced proudly. Elena felt her cheeks grow warm. "I didn't say I play," she corrected gently. "I said I used to." "Same thing, right?" said the librarian with a grin. Grand piano sat in the center of the small stage. It was an older instrument, probably donated to the school years ago. The black finish was slightly worn in places, and a few of the keys had small chips on the edges. But even from a distance, Elena could tell it was a decent piano, not the finest she had ever seen, but respectable enough. On the music stand sat a stack of sheet music. The piece on top was turned to the first page, and Elena recognized it immediately, even before she got close enough to read the title. Her heart did something strange in her chest, a kind of skip or flutter that she hadn't felt in a very long time. It was Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, one of the most difficult and beautiful pieces ever written for piano, and also one that Elena knew better than almost any other piece in the world. Elena stood frozen for a moment, staring at the sheet music on the piano stand. The teachers around her had no idea what was happening inside her mind. They saw only a quiet older woman in a gray cardigan looking at some papers. But Elena was somewhere else entirely. She was remembering the first time she had ever played this piece. It was in a practice room in Havana. When she was just 19 years old, the room had been small and hot, and the piano had been out of tune, but she had played for hours until her fingers ached and her back was sore. That was more than 40 years ago now. Lifetime had passed since then. This is the piece that has been giving you trouble, Elena said softly. Her voice came out a little unsteady, but none of the teachers seemed to notice Mr. Bradley laughed and ran his hand through his curly hair. Giving us trouble is an understatement, he said. I looked it up online, and apparently it's one of the hardest piano pieces ever written. I don't even know why we have it. Here someone must have donated it with a bunch of other music years ago. Mrs. Rodriguez, the choir director, nodded in agreement. I tried to play just the first few bars, she admitted, and my fingers got completely tangled up. I don't think human hands are meant to move that way. The other teachers laughed at this, and Elena managed a small smile. She understood exactly what Mrs. Rodriguez meant. The Chopin Ballade was not a piece for beginners. It was not even a piece for intermediate players. It required years of training and practice and dedication. It required a kind of relationship with the piano that most people never developed. Elena stepped closer to the instrument and ran her fingers lightly along the edge of the wooden frame. The piano was dusty in some spots, and she could see small scratches on the surface. But when she pressed down on one of the keys, the sound that came out was clear and resonant. It was a good piano, better than she had expected for a school auditorium. Do you want to try it? Asked the librarian with the red hair. She gestured toward the piano bench with an encouraging smile. We promise we won't laugh. Elena hesitated. Part of her wanted to walk away and go back to her bench in the hallway and wait quietly for Sophia like she had planned. That was the safe choice. That was what she had been doing for almost 20 years, now staying quiet and staying visible and letting the world forget who she used to be. But another part of her felt something stirring, something she had tried very hard to bury. It was the old hunger, though, need to touch the keys and feel the music come alive under her hands. She had told herself she didn't need that anymore. She had convinced herself that part of her life was over. But standing here now with this piece of music in front of her, she wasn't so sure. I suppose I could try a little bit, Elena said finally. The words came out before she could stop them. Mr. Bradley grinned and pulled out the piano bench for her. Amazing, he said. Take your time. No pressure at all. Elena sat down slowly and adjusted the bench until it was at the right height. This was something she had done thousands of times before. Her body remembered the position, even after all these years. Back straight, but not stiff. Shoulders relaxed. Hands curved gently with fingers hovering just above the keys. Teachers gathered around in a loose semicircle. They were chatting quietly among themselves, not expecting much. After all, this was just a grandmother who said she used to play a little bit. They assumed she would poke at the keys for a minute and then give up like the rest of them. Emma Shun pulled out her phone to check a message. The science teacher with the gray hair was already looking at his watch. None of them were really paying attention. Elena placed her fingers on the opening position. She took a slow, deep breath and closed her eyes for just a moment, and then she began to play. The first notes of the ballade are soft and searching. They rise up from the low end of the piano, like a question being asked in the dark. Elena played them exactly as they were meant to be played, with tenderness and mystery and a hint of sadness underneath. The effect on the room was immediate. Ms. Chun looked up from her phone. Mr. Bradley stopped talking mid-sentence. The science teacher forgot about his watch. Even the librarian who had been fixing her hair froze with her hands still raised, because what they were hearing was not the clumsy fumbling of an amateur. It was something else entirely. It was the sound of someone who knew this music, the way you know your own heartbeat. Elena continued playing, and the melody began to build. The Chopin Ballade is a piece that tells a story without words. It moves through different emotions, like a journey through a landscape. There are moments of quiet beauty and moments of explosive power. There are passages that flow like water and passages that crash like thunder, and Elena played all of them. Her fingers moved across the keys with a speed and precision that seemed almost impossible. She didn't look at the sheet music at all. She didn't need to this. Peace was written inside her memory, carved into her muscles and bones. She had played it hundreds of times on stages all over the world, in New York and London and Paris and Tokyo, in concert halls filled with thousands of people who had paid good money to hear her perform. She had played it for presidents and prime ministers and famous composers. She had played it when she was young and ambitious and hungry for success, and she had played it one last time on a cold night in Vienna before she walked away from everything. That was 18 years ago since. Then she had not touched a piano in public. She had a small keyboard at home that she played sometimes when Sophia was napping, but nothing like this. Nothing. With this kind of instrument and this kind of feeling, the teacher stood in absolute silence. As Elena reached the middle section of the ballade, this was where the music became fierce and demanding. Notes came faster and faster, building toward a climax that shook the walls of the small auditorium. Her hands flew across the keyboard, creating sounds that none of these people had ever heard in person before. Mr. Bradley had his mouth hanging open like a cartoon character. Had taken piano lessons for 6 years as a child, and he had never seen anything like this. He didn't even know it was possible for a human being to play this way. Mrs. Rodriguez had tears forming in the corners of her eyes. She was a musician herself, and she understood what she was witnessing. This wasn't just skill. This was something deeper. This was a lifetime of love and loss and dedication being poured out through an instrument. The music continued to build and build until it reached a peak of intensity that was almost overwhelming. And then it began to soften again. Storm passed, and the melody returned to something gentler and more reflective. Elena played the final section with her eyes closed. She wasn't in the school auditorium anymore. She was back on stage at Carnegie Hall, playing for an audience that had given her a standing ovation. She was in her mother's living room in Miami, playing for her family on Christmas Eve. She was in that tiny practice room in Havana, where it had all begun. All of these moments existed together in the music hall. Of these memories came flooding back through her fingers, and when she finally played the last thundering chords of the ballade, the silence that followed was so complete that you could have heard a pin drop from across the room. Elena sat very still for a moment. Hands remained on the keys and her eyes stayed closed. She was breathing a little heavier now, and she could feel her heart pounding in her chest. It had been so long since she had let herself play like that, so long since she had allowed the music to take over completely. She had forgotten how it felt, or maybe she had tried to forget because remembering was too painful. Slowly, she opened her eyes and turned to look at the teachers. They were all staring at her with expressions of complete shock. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. It was as if they had witnessed something they couldn't quite believe, something that didn't fit with their understanding of how the world worked. Elena folded her hands in her lap and gave them a small, uncertain smile. It has been a while, she said quietly. I hope that was okay. The words hung in the air for a long moment. Still nobody said anything, because what could you possibly say after something like that? Silence in the auditorium stretched on for what felt like forever. Elena could feel the weight of their stares pressing down her. She had made a mistake. She knew that now. For almost 20 years, she had kept this part of herself hidden away like a secret, locked in a box, and in one weak moment she had let it all come spilling out in front of complete strangers. What had she been thinking? Mr. Bradley was the first one to finally speak. His voice came out in a whisper that was barely audible. What the heck was that? Elena shifted uncomfortably on the piano bench. She wasn't used to this kind of attention anymore. There was a time when she had lived for applause and admiration, when the spotlight had felt like home. But that was a different version of herself, a woman who existed only in old photographs and fading memories. I told you, she said softly, I used to play a little. Miss Chun let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a gasp. Little, she repeated. That was not a little. That was absolutely insane. I have never heard anything like that in my entire life. The other teachers began to murmur in agreement. They were looking at Elena with a mixture of awe and confusion. None of them could understand how this ordinary-looking grandmother had just played one of the most difficult pieces of music ever written, as if it were nothing. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward with tears still glistening in her eyes. She was trembling slightly, and her voice shook when she spoke. "That was the most beautiful thing I have ever witnessed," she said. "I have been teaching music for 30 years, and I have never seen anyone play like that." "Who are you?" Elena felt her throat tighten. She didn't want to answer that question. She hadn't answered it honestly in nearly 2 decades. Whenever anyone asked about her past, she would simply say she was retired. She never mentioned what she had retired from. It was easier, that way easier, to be invisible, easier to be forgotten. "Him, just a grandmother," she said quietly. "I'm here to pick up my granddaughter from her piano lesson, that is all." But Mr. Bradley was already pulling out his phone. He had a suspicious look in his eyes, like a detective who had just found an important clue. "Hold on," he said. "I have to look something up." Elena watched him nervously as his fingers moved across the screen. She knew what was coming. She had been dreading this moment for years. The internet had made it impossible to truly disappear. No matter how hard you tried to hide your past, it was always just a few clicks away. Mr. Bradley typed something into the search bar and waited for the results to load. His eyes went wide almost immediately. He looked up at Elena and then back at his phone and then at Elena again. "Oh my God," he whispered. The other teachers crowded around him, trying to see what he had found. Miss Chun grabbed his arm and pulled the phone closer so she could read the screen. Her face went pale. "No way," she breathed. "There is no way." Mrs. Rodriguez pushed her reading glasses onto her nose and leaned in to look. When she saw what was on the screen, she let out a small cry and covered her mouth with her hand. Science teacher with gray hair looked over their shoulders, and his eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared into his hairline. The librarian with red hair just stood there, shaking her head in disbelief. Mr. Bradley turned the phone around so Elena could see the screen on. It was a Wikipedia page with a photograph of a much younger woman. The woman in the photo had dark hair and bright eyes, and she was sitting at a grand piano on a magnificent stage. She was wearing a long black dress, and her hands were poised elegantly over the keys. The name at the top of the page read Elena Vasquez Martin. Below the name was a list of accomplishments that stretched down the entire screen. Cuban-American concert pianist, winner of the International Chopin Piano Competition, 1987. Performed with the New York Philharmonic, the London Symphony Orchestra, the Berlin Philharmonic, and dozens of other world famous ensembles. Recorded over 40 albums. Nominated for multiple Grammy Awards. Performed at the White House for 3 different presidents. Retired from public performance in 2007 following a hand injury. Elena stared at the photograph of her younger self. It was strange to look at that woman. Now she remembered being her, but it felt like remembering a character from a movie, someone she had watched on screen, rather than someone she had actually been. "That was you," Mr. Bradley said. His voice was filled with disbelief. "You are Elena Vasquez Martin. You are one of the greatest pianists in the world." Elena shook her head slowly. "I wish," she corrected him gently. "That was a long time ago. I am not that person anymore." But Mrs. Rodriguez was not accepting that answer. She stepped closer to Elena with an expression of pure wonder on her face. "You won the Chopin competition," she said. "That is the most prestigious piano competition in the entire world. Only one person wins every 5 years, and you won it." Elena nodded slowly. "Yes, that is true. I was very young then, just 23 years old, and you played at Carnegie Hall." Miss Chun added she had taken Mr. Bradley's phone and was scrolling through the Wikipedia page. "It says here, you performed there over 50 times. That is correct," Elena admitted, "although I stopped counting after a while." The teachers looked at each other in stunned silence. They were trying to process what they had just learned 20 minutes ago. They had invited a random grandmother to try playing an impossible piece of music as a joke. They had expected her to fumble through a few notes and laugh about how difficult it was instead. They had accidentally challenged one of the most accomplished pianists of the 20th century. It was like asking someone to shoot a few hoops and discovering they were Michael Jordan, or asking someone to sing a song and realizing they were a legendary opera star. The situation was so absurd that Mr. Bradley actually started laughing. He couldn't help himself. "I asked you if you could play a little," he said between laughs. "I invited you to come try out this impossible piece. I thought I was being nice to a grandmother who maybe took lessons as a kiddo." "My God, I am such an idiot." Elena found herself smiling despite her discomfort. "It is not your fault," she said. "You had no way of knowing. How could anyone know I did not exactly announce myself when I walked in?" The librarian was still scrolling through information on her own phone. Now she looked up with wide eyes. "It says here that you stopped performing because of a hand injury," she said. "Is that true?" Elena lifted her right hand and looked at it. There was a thin scar running across the back of her palm near her wrist. Most people never noticed it, but she was always aware it was there. "Yes," she said quietly. "There was an accident. I cut my hand very badly on some broken glass. The doctor said I would never play at a professional level again. Nerves were damaged. I lost some of the feeling in two of my fingers." Mrs. Rodriguez gasped softly. "That is devastating," she said. "For someone with your talent to lose the ability to play. How did you cope with that?" Elena was quiet for a long moment. This was the part of the story she never talked about, the dark years after her injury when she had felt like her entire identity had been ripped away. She had spent her whole life being Elena the pianist. When that was taken from her, she didn't know who she was anymore. "It was very difficult," she admitted finally. "For a long time I did not cope. Ali fell into a deep depression. I pushed away everyone who loved me, stopped leaving my apartment. I thought my life was over." The teachers listened in respectful silence. This was not the glamorous story they had expected to hear. This was something raw and honest and painful. "What changed?" Miss Chen asked gently. "What brought you back?" Elena smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. "My daughter," she said. "She had a baby, a little girl named Sophia, and when I held that baby for the first time I realized that my life was not about me anymore. I had a reason to keep going. I had someone who needed mesh." Paused and glanced toward the door of the auditorium. Somewhere down the hall, her granddaughter was finishing her piano lesson. "The same granddaughter who had given her a reason to live again. Sophia is the one who brought me back to music," she continued. "She started asking me to teach her piano at first. I said no, I could not bear to touch the keys. But she kept asking and asking with those big brown eyes. How could I refuse her? So I started playing again, not like before, not at a professional level, but enough to teach a little girl her first songs, enough to remember why I fell in love with music in the first place." The room was completely silent now, except for the distant sound of children in the hallway. Every teacher in that auditorium was hanging on Elena's words. They had come to school that day expecting an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Instead, they had stumbled into something extraordinary, a chance encounter with a living legend who had been hiding in plain sight all along. The sound of small footsteps echoed down the hallway, and everyone in the auditorium turned toward the door. A moment later, a little girl appeared in the entrance. She had long dark hair tied back in two braids, and she was carrying a purple backpack that was almost as big as she was. Her eyes scanned the room until they landed on Elena Buela. She called out with a huge smile spreading across her face, "I finished my lesson. I learned a new song. Do you want to hear it?" Elena felt her heart swell at the sight of her granddaughter. This was why she had kept going all these years. This little girl with the bright eyes and the endless energy. This child who looked at her not as a famous pianist or a broken artist, but simply as her grandmother. "Of course, I want to hear it," Elena said warmly, "but maybe later when we get home, right? Now we should let these nice teachers get back to their afternoon." Sophia ran across the auditorium. and climbed up onto the piano bench next to Elena. She noticed all the adults standing around staring, and she looked up at her grandmother with curiosity. "Why is everyone looking at you? Abuela, did you do something funny?" Mr. Bradley let out a surprised laugh. "Funny is not exactly the word I would use," he said. "Your grandmother just did something absolutely incredible." Sophia tilted her head to the side like a confused puppy. "What did she do?" Teachers exchanged glances with each other. None of them were quite sure how to explain to a 7-year-old that her grandmother was secretly one of the most famous musicians in modern history. Mrs. Rodriguez knelt down, so she was at eye level with Sophia. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "did you know that your grandmother used to play piano?" Sophia nodded enthusiastically. "Of course, I know that she plays with me all the time at home. She taught me how to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and Mary Had a Little Lamb, and lots of other songs." Mrs. Rodriguez smiled. "Well, it turns out your grandmother is very, very good at piano, much better than any of us realized." Sophia looked up at Elena with a proud expression. "No," she said matter-of-factly, "Abuela is the best at everything." Elena felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. Children had such simple faith in the people they loved. To Sophia, it was obvious that her grandmother was special. She didn't need Wikipedia articles or concert recordings to prove it. She just knew. Miss Chen stepped forward, holding her phone. "Sophia, can I show you something?" she asked. Sophia nodded, and Miss Chen turned the screen so the little girl could see on. It was a video from many years ago. It showed a woman in an elegant black gown sitting at a grand piano on an enormous stage. The concert hall was packed with thousands of people, and the woman was playing with such intensity that the camera seemed to shake. Sophia watched for a moment, and then her eyes went wide. "Abuela," she gasped. "That is you. You look so pretty, and the piano is so big." Elena watched her granddaughter watching the video. It was surreal to see her past and present colliding like this. For so long she had kept these two worlds separate. The grandmother who made pancakes and read bedtime stories, and the concert pianist who had traveled the world and performed for royalty. She had never wanted Sophia to know about that other life. She was afraid it would change the way her granddaughter saw her. But looking at Sophia's face, now Elena realized she had been wrong. The little girl was not intimidated or confused. She was simply delighted to discover something new about someone she already loved. "Were you famous, Abuela?" Sophia asked. Elena hesitated before answering. "I suppose I was," she admitted, "a long time ago. Many people used to come and listen to me play." "Why did you stop?" The question hung in the air. Elena looked down at her scarred hand. She had never told Sophia the full story of what happened. The accident had occurred before Sophia was born, and Elena had always avoided the subject. But now, with everyone watching, she realized it was time to be honest. "I hurt my hand," Elena said simply. "And after that, I could not play the same way anymore, so I decided to stop performing." Sophia reached out and took her grandmother's hand in both of her small ones. She examined the scar with serious eyes. "Does it still hurt?" she asked. "Sometimes," Elena admitted, "but not as much as it used to." Sophia leaned forward and kissed the scar very gently. "There," she said. "Now it will feel better, Abuela. Kisses always make things better. You told me so." Elena felt a tear slide down her cheek. She pulled Sophia into a tight hug and held her close. The teachers watching this scene were struggling to keep their own composure. Mr. Bradley had to look away and pretend to examine something on the ceiling. The librarian was openly crying now, and not even trying to hide it. After a long moment, Elena released Sophia and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "We should go home now," she said. "It is getting late." But before she could stand up, the door of the auditorium opened again. Woman in her late 30s walked in. She had the same dark hair and bright eyes as Sophia, and she was wearing nurse scrubs with colorful cartoon characters on them. This was Elena's daughter, Carmen. Sophia ran toward her mother immediately. "Mama, Mama," she shouted. "Guess what? Abuela is famous. She played piano for lots and lots of people." There are videos of her on the internet. Carmen stopped in her tracks and looked at her mother with surprise. She knew about Elena's past, of course. She had grown up attending her mother's concerts and watching her practice for hours every day, but Elena had made it clear years ago that she did not want to discuss those times. She had asked her family to respect her privacy and let her fade into obscurity. What happened? Carmen asked carefully. Elena sighed and gestured toward the group of teachers. These kind people invited me to play something, she explained, and I suppose I got a little carried away. Little carried away, Mr. Bradley repeated. She played the entire Chopin ballade from memory. It was the most amazing thing any of us have ever seen. Carmen stared at her mother with an expression that was hard to read. There was surprise there, certainly, but there was also something else, something that looked almost like hope. You played, Elena, she said softly. You really played? Elena nodded. I Daddy, do not know what came over me. It's been so long. Carmen crossed the room and sat down on the piano bench next to her mother. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just sat there side by side, looking at the black and white keys. You remember when I was little, Carmen finally said, and you used to let me sit next to you while you practiced. I would fall asleep listening to you play. It was the most peaceful feeling in the world. Elena smiled at the memory. You were always such a good sleeper, she said. Even thunderstorms could not wake you up once you fell asleep to my practicing. Nothing could disturb you. Carmen laughed softly. I have missed that, she admitted. I have missed hearing you play for years. I wanted to ask you to play something for me just once, but I knew you were not ready. I did not want to push you. Elena felt another wave of emotion rising in her chest. She had not realized how much her silence had affected her daughter. She had been so focused on her own pain that she had not considered what it meant for the people who loved Harry. I'm sorry, Elena said quietly. I did not mean to shut you out. I just could not face it. The music was connected to so much loss, my career, my identity, everything I thought I was supposed to be. When that was taken away, I did not know how to exist anymore. Carmen took her mother's hand. But you did exist, she said. You became something else, something just as important, maybe even more important. You became a Bola Sofia who had been watching this conversation with serious attention. Climbed back onto the bench. Now all three generations were sitting together in front of the piano. Three women connected by blood and love and music. Abuela Sofia said, tugging at Elena's sleeve, will you teach me to play like that? Like in the video. Elena looked at her granddaughter, and then at her daughter, and then at the teachers who were still watching from across the room. Something had shifted inside her today. Door that had been locked for 18 years had finally cracked open. She did not know if she could ever perform professionally again. The damage to her hand was real and permanent. But maybe that did not matter anymore. Maybe there was another way to share her gift. Maybe she did not need concert halls and standing ovations. Maybe all she needed was this, a piano, and the people she loved. I will teach you everything I know, Elena said finally. And I think it is time I stopped hiding from who I used to be. She turned to look at the teachers who had accidentally changed her life. Thank you, she said to them. You have no idea what you have done for me today. Mr. Bradley shook his head in amazement. We did not do anything, he said. We just asked the grandmother to play piano. Elena smiled. Sometimes, she said, that is all it takes. The news spread through Jefferson Elementary School like wildfire. By the next morning, every teacher and staff member had heard the story about the grandmother, who turned out to be a world-famous pianist by the end of the week. Parents were talking about it at pickup and drop-off. Someone had recorded a short clip of Elena playing on their phone, and it had been shared hundreds of times in the school community group chat. The principal, a tall woman named Mrs. Okonkwo, called Elena personally to ask if the story was true. When Elena confirmed it, the principal could barely contain her excitement. She had grown up listening to Elena's recordings. Her own mother had been a huge fan and had taken her to see Elena perform live in Chicago when she was just a teenager. That concert had inspired her to learn piano herself. She never became a professional musician, but the memory had stayed with her for over 30 years. Mrs. Okonkwo asked Elena if she would consider coming to speak to the students, not as a performer, but as a guest speaker. She wanted the children to hear Elena's story, the struggle she had overcome, the passion she had for her art, the way she had rebuilt her life after losing everything she thought defined her. Elena hesitated at first. Public speaking was different from performing. When she played piano, she could hide behind the music. The notes spoke for her, and she did not have to find the right words. But standing in front of a room full of children and talking about herself, that felt terrifying in a completely different way. She thought about it for several days. Carmen encouraged her to say yes, so did Sophia, who was absolutely thrilled by the idea of her grandmother being a special guest at her schooling. The end. It was something Mr. Bradley said that convinced her. He had called to thank her again for that afternoon in the auditorium. During their conversation, he mentioned that several of his students had started asking about piano lessons. After hearing about what happened, kids who had never shown any interest in music before were suddenly curious. They wanted to know if they could learn to play like the grandmother in the video. That is the power of what you did, Mr. Bradley told her. You inspired people without even trying. Imagine what you could do if you actually tried. Elena agreed to come to the school the following Friday. She had one condition. Though she did not want to give a formal speech or lecture, she wanted to play. Mrs. Okonkwo was overjoyed and immediately began making arrangements. The entire school would gather in the auditorium for a special assembly. All 450 students from kindergarten through 5th grade, plus teachers and staff, and even some parents who had heard the news and asked permission to attend. The Friday of the assembly arrived cool and clear. Elena woke up early that morning feeling something she had not felt in almost 2 decades. Nerves, real genuine performance nerves, the kind that made your stomach flutter and your hands tremble slightly. She had thought she would never experience that feeling again. Part of her had believed that the performer inside her was dead and gone, but here it was alive and awake and demanding to be acknowledged. Carmen drove her to the school and helped her get settled backstage. Sophia was buzzing with excitement and kept running back and forth between her classroom and the auditorium to check on preparations. She had told everyone that her grandmother was the special guest. Some of her classmates did not believe her at first, but they would find out soon enough. At 10 o'clock, the students began filing into the auditorium. The noise was incredible. Hundreds of children talking and laughing and shuffling into their seats. Teachers walked up and down the aisles trying to maintain order. The energy in the room was electric with anticipation. Elena peeked out from behind the curtain and felt her heart skip. This was nothing like the concert halls she used to perform in. There were no chandeliers or velvet seats or formally dressed audience members. Instead, there were tiny chairs and colorful sneakers and hand-drawn welcome signs that some of the classes had made. One sign said, "Thank you for coming," with the letters written in rainbow colors. Another said, "We love music," with little music notes drawn around the edges. It was simple and imperfect and absolutely beautiful. Mrs. Okonkwo walked onto the stage, and the room gradually fell silent. "Good morning, everyone," she said into the microphone. Today, we have a very special guest. She is someone who has traveled all over the world sharing her music. She has played for kings and queens and presidents. She has performed in the most famous concert halls on every continent, and she also happens to be the grandmother of one of our 2nd grade students. The children began whispering excitedly, and several heads turned toward Sophia, who was beaming with pride. "In the front row, please. Welcome Mrs. Elena Vasquez Martin." The applause that followed was enthusiastic but chaotic. Some children clapped while others cheered. A few of the younger ones stomped their feet on the floor. It was not the polished, refined applause of a concert audience. It was something better. It was pure and honest and full of joy. Elena walked slowly onto the stage. She was wearing a simple blue dress that Carmen had helped her pick out nothing fancy or glamorous, just something comfortable that made her feel like herself. She sat down at the grand piano and adjusted the microphone that had been set up nearby for a moment. She just looked out at the sea of young faces, so many eyes watching her, so much curiosity and wonder. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "Hello, everyone," she said. Her voice was soft, but the microphone carried it clearly through the room. "Thank you for having me here today. I want to tell you a little story before I play one. I was about your age. I lived in a country called Cuba. My family did not have very much money. We lived in a small apartment with thin walls and noisy neighbors. But we had one special thing: an old piano that my grandmother had owned. It was out of tune, and some of the keys were chipped, but to me it was the most magical thing in the world. The children listened in rapt attention. Even the kindergartners, who usually had trouble sitting, still were focused on her words. I taught myself to play on that piano," Elena continued. "I would practice for hours every day. My fingers would get sore and my back would ache, but I did not care, because when I played, I felt like I could fly. I felt like anything was possible." She paused and looked down at her scarred hand. "Many years later, I had an accident," she said. "I hurt my hand very badly. The doctors told me I would never play the same way again. I was so sad that I stopped playing completely. I thought my life was over. I thought music had left me forever." The room was completely silent now. Even the adults standing along the walls were hanging on every word. "But then something wonderful happened," Elena said with a smile. "My granddaughter was born, and when she got older, she asked me to teach her piano. At first I said no, I was too scared to try, but she kept asking and asking. And finally I said yes." She looked at Sophia in the front row. "Little girl taught me something very important," she said. "She taught me that music is not about being perfect. It is not about winning competitions or playing in fancy concert halls. Music is about sharing something beautiful with the people you love. It is about connecting with others. It is about expressing what is in your heart." Sophia was crying now, and so was Carmen, who was standing near the back of the room. Elena turned to face the piano. "So today I'm going to play for you," she said, "not because I am a famous pianist, but because I am a grandmother who loves music, and I want to share that love with all of you." She did not play the Chopin ballad this time. Instead, she started with something simpler, a gentle lullaby that her own mother had sung to her when she was a child in Havana. The melody was sweet and tender, and it floated through the auditorium like a warm breeze. Some of the younger children swayed in their seats. A few of them closed their eyes. Then she transitioned into something more playful, a jazzy improvisation that had the kids clapping along and bouncing in their chairs. She played fast and then slow. She played loud and then soft. She took them on a journey through different moods and emotions, showing them everything that music could. Before her final piece, she played the main theme from a popular animated movie. The children recognized it immediately and began singing along. Their voices filled the auditorium, mixing with the piano notes. It was messy and imperfect and absolutely magical. When the last note faded away, the room erupted. The children jumped to their feet, cheering and clapping. Teachers wiped tears from their eyes. Parents in the back were recording on their phones. It was not a standing ovation in the traditional sense. It was something much more powerful. It was pure, unfiltered appreciation from people who had just experienced something special. Elena stood up from the piano bench and faced the audience. She felt something she had not felt in 18 years. She felt whole again. "Thank you," she said. "Simply never stop making music. Never stop sharing your gifts with others. You never know whose life you might change." She looked at Mr. Bradley and the other teachers who had challenged her to play that day in the auditorium. "And never stop inviting people to try," she added with a smile. "You never know what music they might be carrying inside them." As she walked off the stage, Sophia broke free from her row and ran to meet her. Elena scooped her granddaughter into her arms and held her tight. The cameras kept flashing and people kept clapping, but Elena barely noticed. She was exactly where she was supposed to be not on a stage in Vienna or a concert hall in New York, but here in an elementary school auditorium, holding the little girl who had brought her back to life, and finally ready to let the music flow again.